Hello and welcome. How heavy have Russia's losses actually been so far? We are talking about new numbers that we have and more what's happening along the front lines in this situation report. The Ukrainian GUR, that's the military intelligence, is continuing to issue warnings for a coming Russian offensive. They are saying because Russia's weakness, they won't be able to attack along the whole possible front line, but they will have to concentrate their forces in certain areas. They consider the Donbas to be the most likely target, so probably the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk. Supposedly, there are rumors now that the Russian armed forces are being ordered by Putin to conquer all of Luhansk and Donetsk by March, likely the end of March, even though I haven't read exactly to whether it means the 1st of March or the 31st, which is obviously a big difference. Generally, though, likely in preparation for the offensive, there are news that the cell phone network was turned off in all of Luhansk, probably for OPSEC reasons, to prevent the Ukrainians from finding out some certain troop redeployments. Along the whole eastern front north of the Sieviesky Donetsk, we have reports of heavy fighting. The Russians seem to increasingly concentrate around the areas of Crimea when it comes to the intensity of their attacks and the artillery fire. It's likely that they soon want to attack in the direction of Liman and then further to Izium. That's what we can see right now. We have Russian military bloggers, one claiming that they gained 800 meters close to Crimea. Another one was even talking about a 2-kilometer breakthrough in the areas around Crimea. We don't have confirmation of either as of yet, but there are a number of reports that might indicate that the Russians actually gained some ground southwest of Crimea. Also, fighting is continuing along the rest of the front line as it does the whole time, but there doesn't seem to be any changes. As said, in general, though, I can't prove any change, but at least according to the reports, there is a fair likelihood of Russian advances south of Crimea. Serhiy Haidai, who is the Ukrainian governor for Luhansk, is saying there is currently intensive artillery fire along the front line, especially around Crimea, and he is judging this artillery fire to be caused. The reason behind that supposedly is that it's preparation for the coming offensive. So basically the Russians are preparing the offensive with their artillery fire right now. South of the Sieviesky Donetsk, we have conflicting reports about Bilohorivka. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, a lot of the Russian military bloggers were saying Bilohorivka has fallen. I'm not completely sure if they... first of all, it's being disputed here by Vorgonzo. That's the Russian way to write Bilohorivka, that the attacks were not successful. But what might have been overseen, that there's another Bilohorivka here. I think this town must exist like 30 times in Ukraine, which has actually fallen in the last few days. So it seems highly unlikely that the northern Bilohorivka has fallen to Russian attacks, even though there are some reports in this regard. As said, Vorgonzo, for instance, is disputing that they have been successful here, whereas we know that the southern one is now in Russian hands. During the attacks towards Bilohorivka, there are indications, you can find it on Twitter, for instance, that the attacks have been done by Russian fighters using Ukrainian uniforms and actually Ukrainian insignia and like armbands to identify themselves as Ukrainians. You might remember that there was a video around of a Russian fighter using Ukrainian uniforms and then killing 2 Ukrainian soldiers point blank who didn't understand they were supposed to capitulate, even though he was shouting it at them because they were shouting, we are friendly the whole time, and then he shoots them point blank and kills them. If this is actually the truth, that the Russians are using Ukrainian uniforms here, be it Wagner or be it regular troops, then that would be a war crime, as it is obviously forbidden to use the enemy's uniform in active combat. When it comes to active combat operations. You can use it for camouflage to a certain point, but as soon as the fighting is engaged, you have to identify yourself as a soldier of your own armed forces. In this case, it might not have happened. Then that would be a war crime. Further south, we have reports that the Russians have advanced further in the north here. The towns of Sakui, Vanzeti, interesting name, sounds almost Italian, is conquered, as well as Mykolaiv, which is right to its east. Further east, we also have the southern Bilohorivka that has fallen, so the Russians are slowly advancing north here. Girkin, for instance, some military bloggers like him are claiming that they want to advance towards Siversk. Little too early to say that, and we will see how the advances are going to continue further from here. In Bakhmut itself, there are reports about heavy fighting, and we have indications that the Russians actually have advanced somewhat in the city of Bakhmut, both in the south as well as in the east. We can't confirm as of now whether those advances have been in the last 48 hours or whether those advances are older, but there are now image proof that the Russians are deeper in the town than they have been recently. Fighting is continuing further south. In Avdiivka, there is no reports of any advances in this area, in case you wonder. So the lines of communications are still open, and it's even admitted from, for instance, Prigozhin was disputing, I think it was DNR claims that that Bakhmut is in an operational encirclement. He insisted, no, the lines of communication are still open. They don't seem to have advanced further towards the T0504, which is that road here into Bakhmut. Further south, reports about fighting around Avdiivka, no changes in territory here. Fighting around Marinka, also no changes in territory being confirmed. Fighting is also continuing around Vuhledar. The Russians are reporting Ukrainian counterattacks, but there are no changes in possession of the territory reported here. Some Russians are claiming that basically it's turning to positional fighting, that the front line has stabilized at a certain point there. A Ukrainian officer was interviewed about the situation on the ground, and he mentioned something interesting about the situation around Bakhmut. He said the whole situation changed dramatically as Wagner elite forces and GRU units, that's the Russian military intelligence, were appearing. It seems that after Wagner most likely ran out of most of its prisoners, they might have started to use their regular mercenaries that are considered to be fairly well equipped and fairly well trained, that actually are attributed some combat value, and they might have attacked there in combination with Spetsnaz forces, and might be the reason that the front line is now in movement again. Further in the southern area, a Ukrainian speaker for the Ukrainian armed forces in the region was claiming that Putin has ordered the capture of Zaporizhzhia city for the 31st of March. Whether that's likely can be highly disputed, so whether it's likely that they're going to capture it. Whether or not he said that is far beyond my ability to confirm here. The Russians are also supposedly stepping up their commando raids onto the islands in the delta of the Dnipro. The Ukrainians are believing that this is to create some pressure to gain Ukrainian attention, to basically fix Ukrainian forces here, maybe even draw in some reinforcements. And they think this is done with the reason to weaken other front lines, to basically allow an offensive that they expect in this region here to start soon, to enable it, to make it more easy in this regard. Right now we have to say that whatever they do, crossing the Dnipro with sizable forces, creating a bridgehead and advancing from there is basically out of the question. So their attempts to draw in reinforcements should be more or less limited in success, as the Ukrainians are well aware that there is no serious threat of a Russian crossing of the Dnipro as of this moment. Riba, and that's fairly interesting. Riba is saying that the Ukrainians have been active. You can scroll through here. And I scroll through here, and you can pause it so you can read it if you want to. But according to Riba, the Ukrainians have been active along those two islands here, Krugloye and Dolgi. If I understand it correctly, that Riba doesn't claim they landed on it, but rather that they did recon with fast attack boats or fast speed boats, so I guess some ribs or something, going with high speed in that area. And that's somewhat important, as it would indicate the first Ukrainian presence south of the Kinburn Spit since Russia has crossed the Dnipro in its advance in February and March. That's it already from the southern front line. The whole front line is more or less stable, even though the Russians are advancing slowly around Bakhmut. Basically, everyone right now is holding his breath for when the big Russian offensive that is expected to start. But we have new informations. The New York Times has reported, according to Western estimates, Russia has by now suffered 200,000 men in losses. That's killed, wounded, and missing. This is especially contributed to the high losses around Bakhmut, where the losses have been in the high 3 digits every single day over the last few months. And just a few days ago, the chief of the Norwegian armed forces said that, according to his estimates, 180,000 have been wounded. It's unclear how that number jumped up from 100,000 in just 2-3 months. Because in November, the last saying was 100,000. Maybe the numbers have been recalculated. Maybe now they include Wagner, something like this. But that the Russians lost 100,000 men in 2 months seems still fairly unlikely as of now, even though the losses are tremendous. 200,000 losses on the Russian side alone. And obviously, the Ukrainians will have suffered 6-digit losses by now as well. Partisan activity has been reported from the Crimea. And here we have a video of an IED attack on 2 officers of the Rosgvardia, of the Russian National Guard. It was on the Crimea, and it's the so-called Atesh Ukrainian Tatars are claiming responsibility for that. So Crimean Tatars fighting as partisans here against the Russian Rosgvardia, and supposedly they have killed 2. When it comes to the mobilization, we have some news about the prison population. Between September and October 2022, the prison population was reduced by 23,000, indicating a massive recruitment by Wagner. But since November 22 and January 23, the number only fell by 6,000, indicating a much lower recruitment number, either because the prisoners that were actually capable of fighting are already spent, or because those who didn't want to volunteer are first, or didn't want to jump on that option, first want to see how high the losses actually are and how many are actually getting the pardon that was promised, as there are rumors that Wagner might not release them and rather execute them or imprison them somewhere. So the big wave of recruitment from prisoners seems to be increasingly over. The Ukrainian defense minister was saying that according to his estimates, Russia didn't mobilize 300,000, but actually 500,000 men. This was contradicted, though, by the GUR, by the Ukrainian military intelligence, just a few days prior, where they said that 326,000 Russians are in Ukraine, plus 150,000 in reserve. It's not clear with the Ukrainian defense minister whether he just means the partial mobilization or whether he also includes Wagner, volunteer groups, mobilization, basically everyone that was raised since the beginning of the war. And obviously, if we think about 200,000 losses, then there might actually be space for the total of 500,000 if it's somewhat calculated in this regard. But regardless, we don't know whether he claims that the so-called partial mobilization was actually 500,000 or not. There's reports from the company that produces the microchips that are being used for Russian passports. They have stopped issuing them because the microchips ran out, and thus they can't hand out any further passports. Last year, the Russian government issued 5.4 million passports, which is 40% more than usual, which shows how many Russians have left the country, think about leaving, are preparing to leave, etc. All of this obviously in the context of the war, which gives us some indication of the mood within the Russian population. At the same time, now there's a law on its way. It's not ratified yet, but it's likely to happen. According to that law, Russian commanders would be allowed to imprison soldiers for 10 days without any, would be allowed to arrest them and imprison them without any court order. This is obviously showing us some disciplinary problems among the Russian armed forces, and it would be an indication of a potential coming future mobilization here, that the Russians are basically preparing to act on what we've seen at the beginning of the mobilization, where there were riots, where there were people insulting their officers, all of this, with the attempt by the Russian government and by Gerasimov and Shoigu to professionalize the Russian armed forces. We have to see that in that context, that they want to make sure something like this stops from now on. Russian media is also emphasizing that Turkish, Swedish, and Serbian volunteers are fighting for Russia. Also, there are claims now, a day later, they claim that there are volunteers from 40 nations willing to fight for Russia. But the funny part was that the claim said the Russian government should help them reach the front lines. So they are basically claiming 40 nations volunteers are coming. But at the same time, those might at most be some claims on the internet. Those guys have actually not been traveling to the front lines themselves. In total, I think the Russian talk about volunteers is purely of propaganda value. It's likely that it's some kind of reaction to the International Legion on the Ukrainian side, and obviously aimed at the domestic population to show it that Russia's cause is just, and that's why other nations, people from other nations, are supporting it. The effect of volunteers on the Russian inside, international volunteers in the Russian armed forces, should be negligible, and that some of them might actually appear shouldn't be too much of a surprise. There was, for instance, a case that a German paratrooper deserted, went AWOL in 2014 to join the Russian forces to fight in eastern Donbass. So sometimes one person going AWOL to fight for the Russians doesn't necessarily mean that the Russian claims have some significant support within Russia. The head of the occupation administration on Crimea is saying that that his government will pay for the equipment of Russian soldiers by selling the property of Ukrainians that are being expropriated inside of Crimea. So the Russian government is now taking away private property from Ukrainian citizens inside of Crimea to use the proceeds to pay for the war. And we have a report here from Twitter. I can just play it here. You can read it yourself. Buryats supposedly, so the description I found were, can probably turn it off because you might. So the description are that we have Buryats that are facing Chechens, and the Buryats are saying that they are realizing that they are being used as cannon fodders, and the Chechens supposedly are stopping them from leaving the front lines, from retreating. As it was said a lot of times in the past, that the Chechens are not being used actually in the front line, but rather as second line troops to stop deserters, to stop frontline troops from retreating, etc. All of these here, I leave it running a little bit in the background while I continue, so you can keep reading it if you're interested. This is the thing about the mobilization. We have some more information about the political sphere. Solovyov, who is the famous Russian propagandist on national TV, has now also attacked Igor Girkin as a coward because he retreated from Sloviansk in 2014. It seems that there's a deliberate attack on the reputation of a prominent hardliner, and especially one of the few harsh critics of politics and the military itself, because he's one of the few who kind of gave Putin some kind of responsibility to what was happening. He might it might be a concentrated and an orchestrated attack on his reputation to either shut him down or at least to show him his place in this very moment. At the same time, there are Russian politicians fighting for the suspension of the law for public acquisition. Supposedly it's because it's bureaucratic difficulties to act quickly in case of the war. Some justifications, for instance, that money is only available in July, that is for the whole year, because of budgetary planning, and so they can't spend it to support the war right now. Supposedly this means that those law is supposed to be upended. So I guess no more asking for different offers, but the governments on different levels can hand out the money and order stuff without any oversight, without any big oversight. Obviously, that would shorten the time period for orders, but at the same time, it would allow some people to probably pocket a lot of money if the offers can be given to a friend who owns a company and gives you a solid kickback. As we can see, we've heard the reports from the Ukrainian government going against corrupt politicians. Obviously, there's not just one side in this war where people are intending to fill their pockets while their countrymen are dying. When it comes to the international relationships, we have the report of Leopard 2 being allowed now. The German government has given it permission to allow for the transfer of Leopard 2s, as they have been produced in Germany. And as the German government holds the license, no nation can export them to another nation without permission. No private dealership can do that either. So we are talking about hundreds of potential tanks that cannot be given to anyone unless the German government says so. And this has happened now. I made a special video about it. You can find it somewhere up there in the info box if you want to see it, what the Leopard 2 is actually good for. I made a video about this. Right now, the German state television said about the production of Leopard 2, which is some kind of information when we see the capacity of the German defense sector right now. They say they think they can increase the number of newly produced Leopard 2 to an impressive number of 3 a month next year in 2024, if more are ordered. So with the current order rate, they can't even produce those 3 a month. Obviously, it's private companies, so they won't create factory lines, they won't hire people, they won't order parts unless somebody has paid for them, and nobody has paid for them so far, even though the new German defense minister basically said we need to immediately replace the tanks we're giving Ukraine, and I frankly don't care where the money comes from, we have to order them. So there might be some movement in there. Also, confirmation now that Portugal will deliver Leopard 2s, but according to the media, it's dependent on German deliveries of spare parts, because supposedly the majority of the 37 Leopard 2s owned by the Portuguese is not combat ready, is not in a working order as of now. We also have reports here about further aid to Ukraine. As you can see, it's a long list, a lot of ammo. Heavy machine guns with thermal imaging sights is obviously immensely useful, especially in night battles, especially as heavy machine guns have a certain range. And if it's the Mardus, which seems likely, it can even penetrate some millimeters of armor. So a BTR, a BMP that is caught from the side might even be destroyed with that. Additional javelins, additional AMRAPs, anti-armor rockets, claymore mines, other things, and interesting too, 2 Hawk air defense firing units. So that should mean 2 transporter erector launcher, not full batteries, but still the Hawk anti-air missile is getting basically its comeback in Ukraine. Probably a valid choice as it's more or less obsolete, but still fairly usable against cruise missiles, and basically for free as it's on storage and nobody will ever need it again anymore, likely at least. So you see here a fairly long list. Again, you can pause it if you want to see every single detail of it. We have also a report from the Wall Street Journal. According to that, Turkey, who is member of NATO, who has allowed its private company Baykar that produces the Bayraktar TB3 drones to keep selling them to Ukraine, who has donated 200 armored vehicles to Ukraine, but at the same time they have not introduced sanctions towards Russia. And according to that, a number of Turkish companies have continued to deliver crucial materials to Russia, even to sanctioned companies within Russia. And finally, we have a video about the T-84U Oplot. And obviously, this is something that a lot of you might recognize. It's the so-called Balkenkreuz, which was used by the German armed forces and is being used to show that Ukraine is a Nazi state by the Russian side. Just to put it in some perspective, first of all, we could start with sophistry and say this is not a full Balkenkreuz because the edges are round and not straight. But I think that would actually be sophistry. It has to be put into some perspective at least. The Balkenkreuz was not a Nazi symbol. It was a symbol used by the Nazis. It was starting to be fielded and it was starting to be used in World War I by the Imperial Army. So it was more or less a German symbol until Germany stopped using it after World War II. It was not a specific Nazi symbol. Now, whether it's smart for the Ukrainians to use it is the next question. It seems to be mostly or exclusively being used in the Kharkiv front. So it might be some symbol that is locally in use, like the Russians are not using the Z everywhere, the V everywhere, or the O everywhere. It's more indicating the front lines, or at least it was in the beginning, where the Russian armed forces are situated where they are operating, etc. There are claims that the Balkenkreuz is a simplified version of the Cossack cross. That is a Ukrainian symbol, but it's like opening up as a cross. And this doesn't really look like it. I mean, you could claim it's simplified or whatever, but just to put it in perspective a little more, I have met a Venezuelan woman a couple of years ago who told me that her sister is like Hitler. And I was kind of baffled by that. And she explained to me that means she's determined. She wants to go straight for her goals. She has high self-confidence and like a lot of positive attributes, where I learned the lesson that apparently in Southern America, claiming that somebody is like Hitler doesn't necessarily mean something negative. So it has to, if we judge it, it probably has to be seen in some cultural background. That Ukraine is not Germany. Of course, in Germany, that's in particular usage of the Balkenkreuz made some headlines. That's it should be understood, but I cannot give them carte blanche in any ways here. Obviously, that could be an indication that they want to provoke the Russians by using the symbol that was on German tanks while they marched into the Soviet Union. That could mean that they are hardcore Nazis but don't want to show the swastika. It could mean whatever you want. It's your decision in the end how you judge it. I just put it into some perspective that it doesn't necessarily have to mean that this means Nazis. And we see it all over the time. It's appeared a couple of times at various different units. It seems at least that it's various different units, because the only time where I saw it prominently another time was also in the Kharkiv region. So in theory, it might be that it's just one unit, one brigade using it, but I cannot confirm that. Maybe you want to write something in the description. As said, I don't want to hide this fact for you, because the Russian government already said, like, they posted their embassy, one embassy of theirs posted a picture of a Balkenkreuz on a Ukrainian tank together with a German tank from World War II, and the headline, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. It's up to you how you want to read the fact that they use the Balkenkreuz, but the fact is that they do. That's it from me for now. What do you think? Does this say anything about the Ukrainians, or does it even legitimate the Ukrainian defense of their country? Leave your opinions in the comment section. That helps with the algorithm, and this channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you like what I do and want to help the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. And thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel. If you liked the video, then hit the like button. That really helps with the algorithm as well. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And obviously you can recommend the channel and the videos to your friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.